Breaking news, FBI at ICE raid California governor's home. 2,000 pounds of heroin and human trafficking exposed.
Just before dawn along the US-Mexico border, the kind of silence that usually blankets the desert was broken by something far darker, an eruption of violence so calculated, so precise, that investigators instantly knew this was no street shootout. It was a message. Cartel gunmen moving with military discipline launched a brutal ambush that left 2 police officers and the man they were assigned to protect dead before they even had a chance to react. The attack wasn't sloppy or rushed. It was coordinated, clinical, and chillingly professional in execution, designed not only to eliminate a target, but to announce a shift in the rules of the game. And the rules, it seems, are changing fast. The moment the El Paso tunnel made news headlines, his fate was sealed. To law enforcement, he'd gone underground to evade capture. To those within La Linea, he'd crossed an invisible line. He had become too visible, too unpredictable, too exposed. He was no longer an asset, he was a risk. Cartel politics aren't written in contracts or boardrooms, they're written in blood, and Delta One knew that better than anyone. For months he lived between worlds, part fugitive, part soldier, part dead man walking. He sensed what was coming, but he had no idea how fast or how ruthlessly it would arrive. When the bullets finally came for him, they weren't fired by rivals, they weren't fired by police, they were fired by the very machine he had served and strengthened the cartel itself. And that's the brutal truth of his story. The man who once enforced the rules of the game became the latest reminder of them. In the world of cartels, no one rises too high, no one becomes too famous, and no one escapes when the organization decides it's time to erase a name, even a name as feared as Delta One. Just after midnight in Ciudad Juarez, under the flickering glow of a convenience store sign, 3 men stood outside as if they were just catching a breath after a long shift. 2 of them were off-duty police officers, Miguel Eduardo Gallego Salas and Rigoberto Pulido Escobedo. One, a seasoned veteran with more than a decade on the force, the other barely stepping into his career. Between them was the man who unknowingly carried a death sentence, Ulysses Nache Trujillo, the infamous Delta One. They believed they were safe that night, tucked away from patrol lights and cartel lookouts, shielded by the quiet of an ordinary neighborhood. They were wrong. A car eased into the street, its headlights slicing across their faces. It didn't speed, it didn't swerve, it moved with purpose. When the windows rolled down, there were no shouted threats, no warnings, only the rapid, precise crack of gunfire. It happened so fast, the officers never even reached for their weapons. No chaos, no stray bullets, no panic, just surgical execution. Within seconds, all 3 men collapsed onto the concrete as the vehicle slipped back into the night like it had never been there. Witnesses later told investigators they had never seen anything so clean, so controlled, so unmistakably intentional. This wasn't the work of a desperate street gang. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was a message written in gunfire. Juarez officials immediately recognized the signature, the professionalism, the timing, the cold efficiency. The whispers started almost instantly. La Empresa, a name spoken quietly in police stations and cartel circles alike, a shadow organization that had spent years ascending from obscurity to one of the border's most fearsome forces. And if this assassination was truly their doing, it meant something deeper. They weren't just eliminating targets, they were announcing themselves on a much larger stage. La Empresa's rise didn't happen overnight. Originally, they were nothing more than muscle for La Linea, the hardened enforcement branch of the old Juarez cartel. They were the ones sent to collect, to remind, to clean up problems. But as the traditional cartels fractured under pressure from rivals, from the government, from US agencies, the power vacuum created the perfect breeding ground for a new kind of organization. La Empresa took full advantage. What began as enforcers evolved into architects of their own criminal empire. Today, they operate less like a gang and more like a shadow state. They run extortion rings with the efficiency of a tax system. They conduct kidnappings with logistics that resemble military raids. Their smuggling routes are managed like commercial supply chains, except the merchandise often consists of terrified families, desperate migrants, and those who owe debts they can't repay. Investigators have tied the group to some of the region's most gruesome murders, including a home invasion where an entire family, pregnant mother included, was slaughtered in their own house. To La Empresa, fear isn't a byproduct, it's a strategy. And nowhere is that strategy more evident than in their human trafficking operations, a horrifyingly lucrative backbone of their business. In just one police raid last year, Ciudad Juarez authorities stormed a stash house and discovered 25 migrants crammed into a single suffocating room, 8 women, 2 minors, many barely able to stand. They weren't waiting for help, they were waiting to be moved or sold. Some owed money to the cartel, others were trying to escape their captors. All of them were trapped in the machinery of a criminal enterprise that treats human lives like inventory. Across the border in Sunland Park, New Mexico, U.S. agents uncovered another safe house with similar conditions. 28 migrants rescued, 5 smugglers arrested. The operation traced directly back to La Empresa. Their reach didn't just cross borders, it wove through them. Trujillo Delta One himself had deep ties to these networks. His fingerprints, literal and metaphorical, showed up again and again in investigations related to smuggling routes, stash houses, tunnel systems, and cross-border coordination. The bodies were still being counted when another horror unfolded miles away in Reynosa, a border city long known for cartel turf wars. For days, 5 young musicians had been reported missing their families, begging for answers, clinging to hope. That hope was crushed when authorities uncovered their burned remains, dumped like an afterthought on cartel-controlled ground. They had been lured to what they believed was a paid performance, only to be kidnapped, tortured, and murdered. No ransom demand, no explanation, just brutality for the sake of control. Their deaths were not random, they were symbolic. A reminder that in regions where cartels rule, even artists aren't exempt from becoming collateral. This is why his death mattered, not just because he was a high-value target, but because of what killing him represented. Cartels don't waste resources. They don't execute someone flanked by 2 police officers unless the motive is bigger than a personal vendetta. By eliminating Delta One in broad daylight, La Empresa wasn't just cleaning house, they were issuing a declaration. They were telling the world, and especially the Mexican government, that not even law enforcement can shield those who betray, disrupt, or endanger the organization, not even their own former operatives. The assassination triggered an immediate chain reaction. Juarez felt the ripple first: fear, confusion, retaliation. Migrants began to disappear more frequently. Bodies surfaced in areas once considered neutral. Police already stretched thin suddenly found themselves targeted not as obstacles but as prey. Every arrest they made, every sweep they conducted seemed to provoke more aggression. Communities that had learned to live with cartel activity were now forced to confront a new, harsher truth. This wasn't crime anymore. This was warfare. La Empresa's evolution into a militarized criminal syndicate isn't accidental. It's a direct response to pressure from rivals like CJNG and the Sinaloa cartel. Competition forced them to become smarter, crueler, more strategic. They built safe houses like prisons. They operated kidnapping rings like business units. They refined human trafficking into a multi-billion peso revenue stream. And every time authorities shut down one stash house, another 2 took its place. For thousands of migrants passing through the region, families from Central America, laborers from South America, teenagers fleeing danger, the route north is no longer just dangerous. It's a gauntlet controlled by men with assault rifles and balance sheets. If you can't pay, you disappear. If you try to escape, you're sold. If you resist, you become an example. Delta One knew the system inside and out, perhaps too well, and in the end, the organization he helped strengthen decided he had become a liability too costly to keep alive. And so, on an unremarkable street in Juarez with 2 unsuspecting officers standing beside him, La Empresa delivered the kind of justice they believe keeps their empire running fast, brutal, undeniable. When Juarez police raided the safe house just days after Delta One's execution, they expected chaos, maybe a shootout, maybe a handful of small-time players scrambling to escape. What they found instead was something far more unsettling: a fully operational armory, the kind of place where battles aren't just fought, they're planned. Inside the house in Lázaro Cárdenas, stacked against the walls like inventory in a warehouse, were 38 assault rifles, boxes of ammunition, tactical gear, and multiple handguns. It didn't look like a cartel hideout, it looked like a staging base, a forward operating post, evidence of a group preparing for something bigger than turf wars. And in the corner, barely visible in the gloom, crouched 3 migrants, kidnapped, terrified, and waiting for ransom calls that may never have come. Their families had already received threats. Their captors had already dictated the rules. And if police had been even a few hours later, these 3 human beings would have joined the countless others who vanish into cartel-controlled territory without a trace. The men arrested that night: Jose Uriel, 26, Jesus Roman, 21, and Ricardo N, 22, were no low-level errand boys. They were soldiers of La Empresa, part of the same shadow cartel believed to have orchestrated the triple execution that killed Delta One. Their weapons, their structure, their confidence, it all pointed to a criminal organization operating with the efficiency of a paramilitary group. That raid forced authorities to confront a harsh truth: La Empresa wasn't just expanding, they were preparing for war. The government responded with Operation Black Warrior, a full-scale sweep designed to hit cartel infrastructure hard and fast. Within hours, authorities seized 45 illegal firearms and arrested 10 cartel members across Juarez. On paper, it looked like a victory. Press conferences praised coordination, swift action, rapid results. But on the streets, people whispered a different story, one of unease, not relief. For every man arrested, locals claimed 5 more simply melted back into the shadows. For every safe house shut down, 2 more would surface. And the real bosses, they hadn't flinched. Juarez didn't breathe easier after the operation. It braced itself. Because in Mexico, when a cartel loses guns, hostages, or manpower, they don't retreat, they respond. And that response came swiftly spilling violence far beyond Juarez and into the borderlands where criminal empires intersect with innocent lives. The sun hadn't even set on Juarez's sphere when the violence erupted hundreds of miles away in Tamaulipas, a state long recognized as one of Mexico's most dangerous corridors. According to official reports, a military convoy was traveling along a highway when a white van attempted to ram one of the National Defense vehicles. Soldiers opened fire. By the time the gunsmoke settled, 6 civilians were dead, 5 on the scene, 1 on the way to the hospital. 3 more were injured. The government labeled it a security operation. Locals called it what it felt like: a massacre. Together, the 2 events sent shockwaves from Juarez to Washington. Border agents, already stretched thin, described the atmosphere as electric, the kind of tension that comes just before something breaks. Local police whispered about new cartel alliances forming more organized and more ruthless than anything they had seen in a decade. Federal officials acknowledged quietly that what happened wasn't an isolated flare-up, it was an escalation. Cartel networks weren't just defending territory anymore. They were striking first, striking publicly, and striking without fear of consequences. Just weeks earlier, a horror of equal magnitude had unfolded in Chiapas, where 5 police officers were ambushed in Frontera Comalapa. Gunmen believed to be tied to the CJNG Jalisco New Generation cartel opened fire without warning. The officers died on the spot. Their patrol truck was later found burned to its frame flames, still licking the ground, a gruesome cartel signature meant to send a message: we own these roads. During the ensuing manhunt, 4 cartel suspects were killed in a running gun battle with authorities. But the violence didn't stop. It escalated. In Jalisco, CJNG has transformed into a full-blown militarized force, launching ambushes with machine guns, grenades, and military tactics once reserved for insurgencies. These aren't street-level shootouts anymore. They're coordinated operations, trained squads, tactical formations, execution-style attacks on law enforcement designed to demoralize entire departments. Meanwhile, in Sinaloa, an internal war erupted between the Los Chapitos, the Sons of El Chapo, and the La Maiza faction. These groups command private armies outfitted like national militaries. Their fight has torn through Culiacan, causing the worst violence the city has seen in 15 years. 50 police officers have been killed in the state this year alone. Among them, Jorge Luis Casillas Torres, a 42-year-old municipal officer ambushed while simply driving home through Villa Bonita. He never saw the shooters coming. Everywhere along Mexico's northern states, a grim pattern solidified: patrol cars becoming moving targets, uniforms turning into bullseyes, officers realizing they weren't policing criminals, they were being hunted by them. Juarez was only the spark. Tamaulipas, Chiapas, Jalisco, Sinaloa, these became the wildfire. Crossing into the United States has always been perilous, but now it's something far worse. In the El Paso sector, migrant deaths have skyrocketed since Operation Lone Star began in 2022. By mid-2025, investigators had uncovered 27 sites where human remains were scattered across the desert, evidence of journeys that ended in silence beneath the sun. Why the surge? Because stricter enforcement doesn't stop migration, it pushes migrants into deeper, more remote terrain where the real predators wait. The heat, the exhaustion, the isolation, but above all, the cartels. Criminal groups like the Sinaloa Cartel and CJNG now control nearly every smuggling route. No one crosses without paying their tax. Those who can't pay are ransomed. Those who resist are disappeared. One migrant described how cartels force them to join the organization. If you refuse, they take you out. In Chiapas, rival cartels have turned migrant corridors into killing fields. A teenager and 2 nuns were gunned down in 2025, innocent bystanders caught in the crossfire of territorial warfare. And the brutality reaches beyond migrants. In May 2025, 5 musicians from the band Grupo Fugitivo were lured to Reynosa with promises of a paid performance. Instead, they were kidnapped and executed by members of the Gulf Cartel. Their bodies were burned. 9 suspects were arrested, but arrests don't undo the message no one is safe on cartel-controlled ground. Not civilians, not travelers, not even artists whose only weapon is a guitar. Every step north now carries the same grim question: will they make it to the other side or vanish into the sand? For months, Washington had been watching the rapid escalation along the border with growing unease. But when cartel ambushes turned highways into open war zones and police officers were being executed in broad daylight, the White House stopped calling it a crisis. They called it what they believed it had become: a conflict. And in one of the most dramatic policy shifts in modern US history, President Donald Trump made a declaration that sent shockwaves through military and intelligence circles. Mexican drug cartels were no longer criminal organizations. They were enemy combatants. This wasn't just rhetoric. According to a classified memo sent to Congress, the US now considers itself in an armed conflict with cartel groups. The memo invoked presidential war powers, reframing cartel activity not as transnational crime, but as acts of war that justify military force under international law. Overnight, the borderlands weren't just a political battleground. They were, at least on paper, a theater of war. And Trump didn't stop at declarations. He authorized the Pentagon to conduct operations pursuant to the laws of armed conflict, granting commanders the authority to strike cartel targets with lethal precision. Behind the scenes, the CIA was quietly expanding its covert authorities. Armed surveillance drones capable of tracking, targeting, and eliminating cartel operatives were approved to fly over Mexico. What once sounded like speculation was suddenly becoming reality. America was preparing for a war it had avoided for decades. And behind all the bloodshed is a much darker pattern: the evolution of cartel violence into open confrontation, executed with a level of coordination that resembles insurgent warfare more than organized crime. This wasn't the kind of chaos that erupts from desperation. It was strategy, targeted killings, high visibility executions, cross-border intimidation, a signal that the cartels are shedding whatever limits once defined them. They're no longer hiding in the shadows, they're stepping directly into the spotlight, daring governments to respond. Then came the first blows. In the span of a few weeks, the US military launched 5 deadly strikes against cartel-operated boats in the Caribbean. The vessels believed to be ferrying narcotics were hit with devastating accuracy. 5 traffickers were killed, and these weren't warning shots. These were test runs, proof that the United States was willing to use its military far beyond traditional boundaries. At the same time, a massive maritime buildup unfolded. 8 US warships carrying more than 5,000 sailors, and Marines moved closer to known cartel shipping routes, tightening a noose America had never dared to tighten before. To the public, it looked like pressure, symbolic muscle flexing, but to those who understood the choreography of warfare, it looked like preparation. Every ship, every drone, every memo pointed to the same conclusion: the US was positioning itself not for counter-narcotics operations, but for open conflict. And if the day comes when the first armed drone crosses into Mexican airspace, the war on drugs will stop being a metaphor. It will become a war with all the collateral damage, political upheaval, and international consequences that word implies. But here's the unsettling truth: cartels aren't shrinking in fear. They're adapting faster than anyone expected. Groups like the Sinaloa Cartel and CJNG have evolved into criminal superpowers armed not just with rifles and rocket launchers, but with crypto code surveillance networks and digital laundering pipelines that span continents. Their financial operations now include cryptocurrency transactions designed to obscure billions in drug profits. Their intelligence networks use cell phone data, hacked databases, and public surveillance cameras to identify threats. In some regions, they have become so powerful that they don't just challenge the state they replace it.
I may
In
go
Sinaloa,
there,
investigators revealed that
sometime toward the
cartel
end of the
operatives
week.
were using phone metadata and municipal cameras to hunt down FBI informants. In Jalisco, CJNG fields armored convoys equipped with drone spotters and encrypted comms. These are not street gangs anymore. They are insurgent states' parallel systems operating inside a sovereign nation, funded by fentanyl, fortified with blood, and shielded by corruption. And that's what terrifies US officials the most. Because if cartels continue evolving at this pace, the question isn't whether they can withstand American pressure, it's whether they can export their war north using cyber tools, drones, and decentralized networks that don't rely on borders at all. For now, the fight remains largely in Mexico, but the line is blurring, and every escalation from the US risks pushing cartels to retaliate in ways no one has ever seen on American soil. The border is no longer just a dividing line between two nations. It has become the fault line between two worlds, one governed by law and one ruled by shadow empires with money, weapons, and armies of their own. As cartels mutate into high-tech insurgencies, and the United States edges closer to treating them like foreign enemies, the stakes have never been higher. But here's the haunting reality no one wants to say out loud. The question now echoing across briefing rooms in both countries is painfully simple. Are these attacks the beginning of a new phase 1 where cartels challenge state authority not quietly, but openly? Because if this is their opening move, then the border crisis is no longer a humanitarian emergency or a law enforcement issue. It's something far more volatile, a looming confrontation between nation states and criminal empires that no longer fear them. For years along the dusty spine of the US-Mexico border, one name kept surfacing in briefing rooms, wiretaps, and late-night intel calls: Ulysses Nache Trujillo, better known by the streets as Delta One. To the public, he was a ghost. To law enforcement, he was a nightmare. And to the cartel world, he was the kind of man whose presence could silence an entire room. If the US truly goes to war with the cartels, it won't look like any war we've ever fought. There will be no clear front lines, no battlefields, no uniforms. The enemy will be everywhere, embedded in towns, hidden among migrants, operating through apps, crypto wallets, tunnels, and drones. And the first strike may not be on a remote highway in Mexico. It may be in a city we once believed was untouchable. The cartel world has already chosen its direction. Now America must choose its response. Either side's next move could ignite a conflict that will reshape the entire hemisphere. And the only question left is, when the war finally comes, will we see it arriving or only understand what happened after it's already too late? Delta One wasn't just another trafficker clawing for power. He was the razor edge of La Linea, the enforcement arm of the Juarez cartel, an organization infamous even among cartel circles. La Linea didn't negotiate, they didn't threaten, they didn't warn, they acted, and Delta One was their precision weapon. He built his reputation not through sheer brutality, but through something far more dangerous: intelligence. He understood the border like a second skin, its blind spots, its patrol shifts, its geography, its weaknesses. Smuggling routes weren't just paths to him, they were equations to be solved. When authorities discovered a fully engineered cross-border tunnel in El Paso, 4 feet wide, 6 feet high, reinforced with wooden beams, wired with electricity and ventilation, they didn't just see cartel innovation, they saw Delta One's signature. He wasn't just moving drugs, he was designing infrastructure. He was turning criminal enterprise into an engineering project. And with every tunnel, every shipment, every evasion, he grew bolder. US agents in El Paso flagged him repeatedly: immigration violations, smuggling cases, encrypted communications. Each time they got close, he vanished like smoke. It became clear that he wasn't just surviving the game, he was ahead of it, too far ahead. But in the cartel world, brilliance is a double-edged blade. For all of Delta One's usefulness, his growing notoriety turned him into something far more dangerous to the organization he served: a liability. Cartels don't tolerate loose ends. They don't tolerate attention, and they certainly don't tolerate someone whose mistakes could cost them millions or attract Washington's wrath.